This is the story of how I learned I was blind. If you're new, hi, my name is Tamara. I'm a physically disabled, blind content creator, and on this channel we talk about everything disability, from how-tos to tech reviews and everything in between. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. I have not scripted anything, so it may be a little bit rambly, but I want it to be that way because I want it to be authentic to my experience. I've been legally blind since the day I was born, but it took my parents until I was midway through kindergarten, and me until a very specific day in the first grade to realize that I was different. I'm sure there were many clues prior to me entering school, although my parents were first-time parents and they didn't know any differently. And it was long before the days of online parent groups and understanding what was normal or what wasn't normal. They just assumed I was clumsy and I was accident prone and I was uncoordinated, not necessarily recognizing that that was probably due to the fact that I wasn't seeing things that everybody else could see. It took until I was midway through kindergarten to get a proper diagnosis of oculocutaneous albinism, and that only came about after the school tried to label me with some significant cognitive disabilities, but that's a story for another time. I want to tell you the story about how I learned I was different, and maybe it'll make you feel less alone in your own experience, or maybe it'll start a conversation about the ways that we should interact with people with disabilities. When I was in first grade, I had an EA who was helping me out with things, but I didn't recognize that it was any different than any of the other students because she would go around and help other students too. She would primarily work with me, but it didn't feel different. The students didn't recognize that there was anything different going on or that I was getting special attention. So nothing clicked for me that I was any different from any of the other students until they brought in a specialist. And I don't know what this specialist's qualifications were, but I know they weren't a TVI or a teacher for the visually impaired. They weren't specialized in working with people with blindness, but they'd set up a consultancy because they had their own child who was blind and purported to know how to help blind people through the education system. Now that would be almost unheard of. It was the Wild West when I was growing up. This specialist was supposed to do a presentation for the class about blindness and what blindness was and how you treat blind people. She sat both of the first grade classes down in a big circle, all the desks got pushed out against the wall, and proceeded to hand every single person in the room, except me, sunglasses covered in hot glue or blindfolds. And for the next hour, proceeded to tell everybody in the class how I needed to be treated differently and how I couldn't interact with them the same way and what they should and shouldn't do when they were talking to me. In the morning, I had dozens of friends. I was running around and having a great time at recess. By the afternoon, nobody wanted to come near me. It was the same day they introduced the recess buddy system, where instead of playing with my friends or the people I thought were my friends, I had to go with an assigned recess buddy outside because they wanted to make sure that I was, quote unquote, getting the correct social integration. That was traumatizing on a level that I'm still coming to terms with some 25 years later. And one of the main reasons that I have deep reservations about using blind simulations and giving people an understanding of what someone's disability is without context, without somebody with that lived experience providing the nuance and answering questions in a constructive way. The way the information was presented, the way they told people they had to interact with me came with a whole bunch of new rules for a bunch of 7- and 8-year-olds. And when you're that age, you don't want to get in trouble. You want to do what's right. So it's easier to avoid the thing with more rules than to try and follow the new rules that you've been given. And that's exactly what happened. The students treated me like I was a pariah. I went from being totally normal in one of the gang to something else. It was the day that I learned that having a disability meant that I wasn't enough. I didn't have the words to express all of the things that I experienced on that day. Before then, I'd experienced frustration and I'd experienced the tantrums that any young developing person would experience, but that was the first time. The very first time in my life, I felt rage. I went home from school, I walked through the front door, and instead of the happy, bubbly girl that wanted to go to school, that wanted to learn, that had a deep curiosity to be around others and engage and understand the world, they got something entirely different. I walked through the front door and I took a running headbutt at my father. Now, some of you may laugh, that's an absolutely ridiculous visual, and I agree, it's kind of funny. I didn't have the words to express my anger, and I didn't have a direction to understand where I should direct those feelings. My parents were stunned because that's very out of the ordinary for me. I was a very well-behaved, follow the rules, understand what was expected kind of child, and it took my parents quite a while to figure out what had happened. When they had handed every single student in that room a blindfold except for me, it created a situation where for the first time in my life, I was other. I wasn't someone who belonged, and that hurt me. That was the day I started developing my own internalized ableism, where I wanted to pretend I could see. I wanted to pretend I was able to do more visually than I could because then maybe they would like me. Or if I did better at school, if I was the best in the class, or if I could somehow prove to them that I was capable of doing all the things that they were, if I could play baseball and soccer, well then maybe I'd be enough. None of those things were true. And it went from bad to worse when the parents found out that there was a student with disabilities in their children's class. Because at home, the messaging was reinforced that I don't want my child hanging out with, and I'm using this specifically because this word was used, the R word. But these parents believed that because I had a disability, I was going to somehow taint their child. They didn't want me hanging out with them. I wasn't allowed to go over to some of my friends' houses. I wasn't good enough. I was disabled with a capital D. And to feel that and to go through that, I still don't have the words to express what that feels like. It's when you want to teach someone about another experience, there are ways you can do that which are positive, which are constructive, which don't leave people with lasting trauma. And that was not one of them. I found out at the same time as 32 of my other classmates that I was blind. I found out that I was different, not in a private space where I could understand it, where I would be able to process it or grieve or show emotion or do anything that would be a normal response to information like that. I had to sit there and endure an hour of being told I wasn't good enough. And it sucked. And that hour of my life, it's fundamentally shaped who I am today. The way I visually present, the way I choose to speak, what I've chosen to engage in, how hard I've pushed to be quote unquote normal. And it's taken me this long to recognize that your value is not based on your productivity. Your value is not based on whether you can do something the same way as someone else. Your value is not based on some factor that's external to your control. I can't change the fact that I'm blind. Those are intrinsic parts of me, and they're parts of me that I've had to spend 30 years learning to love. They're parts of me that I tried to reject for the first 16 years of my life. I refused to use a white cane to my own detriment, which caused many, many injuries. I refused to use Braille when it was going to be the only option for me. I didn't want to use a slant desk. I didn't want to use a big desk. I didn't want to go on the short bus. I didn't want anything to visually differentiate me from my peers. And it all came from that one day, that one class, that 1 hour where I wasn't told, I wasn't informed, I wasn't asked if this is something that I even wanted, whether this is something that was going to be okay, whether this is something that I wanted to participate in. And It's left scars. I go into classrooms now. I do public speaking. I share my experiences. I talk about inclusion. I talk about disability, but I do it from a very different perspective. If one of my students or clients is in the class that I am presenting, or I know that there's someone with a disability in that class, I find them, I speak to them before the presentation to ask them, would you like me to pretend I don't know you? Would you like me to talk about it from my own perspective? Would you like me to include you? What are some things you wish your classmates knew, but it can come from me, so it doesn't have to come from you? Where are those boundaries? And it puts the person with a disability in a place of power, in a place of equity to the presenter, because they have some say in what gets said about their experience. Even if we have a shared experience of blindness, even if we have a shared experience of disability, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have the same one or to the same degree. Someone may struggle with something that I don't. Some kids are good at math, others struggle with math. Some are good at reading, others struggle. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and how we present that deeply impacts how people respond to their environment, and how people internalize their experience, and how people feel about themselves. When I go into classrooms, especially young classrooms, I find it's important to explain the difference between equity and equality. And yes, you can explain that to a 6-year-old. When you go into a classroom and there's aides helping one student but not the rest, or one student's getting something in a different way than all the others, kids have a deep sense of justice. They have a deep sense of, well, I want everything to be fair. Everything has to be the same, because when we all get the same sized piece of pie, then everybody's good. That's the right thing to do. But when you actually break it down for kids, they'll understand why that isn't right. And I love the Band-Aid example. I'll go in with Spider-Man and Elsa Band-Aids, and I'll go up to the first student in the row and I'll say, we're gonna pretend you have a boo-boo, and you're gonna have this imaginary boo-boo and you're gonna tell me where it is, and you're gonna pick which one you want. Do you want Elsa or do you want Spider-Man? I'll say Elsa, and I say, okay, where's your boo-boo? It's on my finger. So then I put the Band-Aid on their finger. And then I go to the next one in the row and I say, do you want Elsa or do you want Spider-Man? They'll say, I want Spider-Man. I say, where's your boo-boo? It's on my knee. I say, okay, but I'm gonna put it on your finger. And then usually there's quite an abrupt reaction to that. And I turn to the class and I say, is that fair? And the class universally goes, no, it's not fair. I said, well, why isn't it fair? Well, because his boo-boo's on his knee, not his finger. I said, exactly. Everybody should have the tools or the accommodations that they need to do their best work. For some people, it's glasses. For some people, it's Braille. For some people, it's extra help from an adult who can describe things to them. For some people, it's sign language. It can look different for every student, but it doesn't mean that you're getting different access to information. It doesn't mean that you're getting unfair treatment. Do you understand? And universally, it clicks for kids. So why do we go in and single kids out, that they have to follow all of these rules and that they're going to be treated differently, but not give them the context to understand why? Because what it bred in my classmates in first grade was resentment, because I was getting more than they were, or I was getting, quote unquote, the answers to all the tests, which wasn't true, but that's how they perceived it, because I was getting extra help. I was getting different things from them, and they didn't understand the difference between equity and equality. I think it's important to recognize that while that experience, that isolation was incredibly traumatic for me, none of that was done with ill intention. The specialist, the consultant, all they wanted to do was provide a framework, a script for how others should interact with me. And I think where it went wrong was the fact that I wasn't included in that script. My differences, my uniqueness, my experience wasn't a part of that discussion. And people with disabilities aren't one thing. You could line up 1,000 blind people in a room and every single one of them have a different backstory, have different expectations, have different skills, have different challenges. We are not a monolith. And when you give somebody a single guidebook, it creates a rigid framework where people are not able to be authentic or able to understand unique perspectives or differences that honors the person that's actually there. I think the other piece was fear. When somebody is standing at the front of a room and presenting how you're supposed to interact or not interact and the things you're supposed to say or not say, it creates a lot of fear about engaging with that person because there's more rules. There's more chance for them to get it wrong and be embarrassed. And while I absolutely have my own preferences about the language we should use around disability and how I hope people engage with me and the way I hope things are presented to be inclusive, I would rather somebody use the wrong word or try and be wrong and ask a question rather than assume or avoid me altogether. I know that we live in a world that is deeply prejudiced against disability. I live it every day. We live in a discriminatory society where people like myself, people with differences, are not seen as equal and are feared. Oftentimes because people don't understand what they can or can't do to interact with that person. Not understanding that it's okay just to ask the questions. It's okay just to say, hey, do you need help right now? Or are you good? Or would it be helpful if I guided you here? Just trying to understand someone's situation and then asking them for their input, or trying to recognize what someone's access needs may be and trying to include them. I'm blind and do a whole bunch of things that you would assume on face value are inherently visual or quote unquote not accessible. I sew, I downhill ski, I garden, I go to the movies, I horseback ride, I swim. None of those things are not accessible to me. I may do them in my own way. I may need some slight adaptations or accommodations to get there, but it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be included. And it doesn't mean that I shouldn't get the opportunity to try. I'm hoping that when we talk about disability, especially when we try and introduce the topic of difference and disability to young people, we introduce the idea that these are people. Whether somebody is able to communicate with words, whether somebody's in a wheelchair, whether somebody uses a cane or a guide dog or braille, we're just people and we're worth getting to know because we have cool perspectives. You can ask questions that aren't okay sometimes because that's what life is about. Life is about making mistakes and figuring it out. We don't want to be scared when we're talking to others. So I'm hoping that we're not too scared to ask the right questions because we might get it wrong. Love to open it up to you. If you've made it this far, what have been your experiences? Either feeling like you've put your foot in your mouth or moments that have been really fundamental to your understanding of yourself as a person. Are there more nuanced ways we can have this conversation where everybody gets to be included, not just those who have the loudest voice or those who presume themselves to be experts? I'd love to hear all of those in the comments down below. And I guess I'll just peter off there and say I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.